through the Kentucky State Police files, through the Freedom of Information Act, many attorneys' notes from previous civil trials, and nothing seemed to make sense. Nothing that I read in the Kentucky State Police files seemed to be making any sense as to a connection with what I was reading in the newspapers. I could see that something terribly was wrong, but I didn't have an answer at that time, of course. I want to let you know that this is just the facts. This is not my opinion. This is not the opinion of the former employee that I mentioned before. We went through hundreds of legal depositions, personal interviews. There were files that the state police had put together of everyone that was there. Interviews with where they were at the time that the fire broke out, where were they seated, what room were they in. We went through all of that information and basically put all of that into the book. I decided very early if I was going to do a history of the Beverly Hills Supper Club, I had to talk a little bit about the history of Newport in general. How many people are from the area or at least familiar with Newport's history? Okay, so I think it's important, especially when we're talking to new generations that are coming along and have no idea what the Beverly Hills Club was and no idea of Newport's past. But I think it's very important. A lot of people think of the early Sin City reputation as going back to the 40s or 50s or the 30s, and it actually goes way back to even the late 1800s. Newport was known at that time for some of the illegal activities. The Newport Barracks came along, military installation. Immediately there was prostitution in Newport. Church festivals and lotteries brought some of the early forms of gambling into the area. There were actually slot machines in Newport before 1900. And very quickly, gambling and drinking was just looked at as normal activity in this region. Prohibition came along. Andrew Volstead, the Volstead Act, with the prohibition of the sale and distribution of alcohol, is really what brought in the biggest crime and corruption to the region. George Remus, known as the bootlegging king, had degrees in law and pharmaceuticals. Realized very early that medicinal alcohol was perfectly legal, so that's where he went. He actually bought out several factories and distributed what he considered medicinal alcohol. He hired 12, as he called them, lieutenants, and what he was actually doing was supplying illegal alcohol to the entire Midwest. You see here he was making $2.5 million in the first 3 months. This is again back in the 20s. He originated the payoff. He's the first person we know of nationwide that would pay off the sheriffs and the local authorities so that he could run his operation. It didn't work perfectly. As you can see, the picture we have is a mugshot, so wasn't great at what he did. But his 12 lieutenants all went on to fame and fortune here in the area. Pete Schmidt was one, opened the Glen Hotel in Newport. Jimmy Brink was another who opened the Lookout House over in Kent County. Buck Brady, Bluegrass Inn, and other clubs started opening, all catering to this illegal alcohol. And once Prohibition was over, they all switched to illegal gambling. The Mafia certainly heard about that pretty quickly. They found out that Newport was, in Cincinnati in general, was sort of a wide open market. The Cleveland Syndicate sent in some people of their own, headed by Mo Dalitz. He was part of the Little Jewish Navy. He formed what became the Cleveland Four with Sam Tucker, Morris Kleiman, and Lou Rothkopf, and they pretty much took over Newport at that time. Newport in the 1930s, several clubs were already successful. The Mafia hears Newport's wide open. Cleveland sends in Mo Dalitz. New York Syndicate sends in the Levinson brothers. Most of you are probably familiar with Louis Levinson. Had the nickname of Sleep Out Louie. He loved to engage in all-night poker games, but he was so popular and so powerful that he was allowed to sleep out a few hands if he wanted to. And Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, all very familiar names with the early gambling era of Newport. This is, of course, before Las Vegas existed. Many of these names are familiar with the history of Las Vegas. Well, the Mafia came into northern Kentucky. The Levinsons take over the Arrowhead Club. I say take over because they killed the owner and said, this is our club now. The Cleveland mob took over the Coney Island racetrack, same way. And then they targeted Pete Schmidt's Glen Hotel. Well, Pete was very well known in the area, and they knew that they couldn't just knock him off. People wouldn't notice, I guess. So they started doing many, many things to harass him. One included what was called ding-donging. The henchmen would simply go into the lobby of the Glen Hotel and urinate on the floor, day after day after day. Pete Schmidt finally sold the club to the Cleveland Syndicate when he found rigged dynamite in the basement of his home. He decided to move out of Newport and let the Mafia have that city. He went out to Southgate and took over what was a vacant old speakeasy called the King Tut Castle. He turned that into the first Beverly Hills Club. It became the first of what we know as carpet joints. All the other places in Newport were just dives. They were converted back rooms or basements or second floors to these bars, and you could get buzzed into a secret room to do the gambling and drinking. But the Beverly Hills Club was wide open. Everyone knew it was there. Everyone knew it was illegal. They had chandeliers on the ceiling. I mean, it was a totally different place. Carpet on the floor, hence the name Carpet Joint. Very quickly, the classiest place in the region. The Mafia wanted it very badly. On February 3rd, 1936, they went in and burned the place down because Pete Schmidt would not sell it. This was not unusual with these clubs at that time, and this one would have been completely unnoticed, but a 5-year-old girl that was the niece of the caretakers just happened to be in the building, and she died in the fire. So public outcry demanded justice. There was an investigation, and several of the mobsters were convicted. Red Masterson, who was probably the ringleader, walked free. And Pete Schmidt had a choice. He could get out of the gambling business, which was the mob's suggestion to him. But he did not do that. He revamped the club, remodeled the club, and changed the name to the Beverly Hills Country Club. This is one of the only color pictures. It's actually a postcard of the original Beverly Hills Country Club. Well, Mo DeLeats and his Cleveland Four continued the harassment. They continued ding-donging. They started roughing up customers. They actually robbed the payroll twice. No masks or anything, but no one could identify the culprits. And we mentioned the dynamite. So Schmidt finally sells the club to the Cleveland Syndicate. Sam Schrader and Sam Tucker, again, two of Remus's henchmen, were put in charge. In 1940, according to the deeds that we have copies of, the Cleveland Syndicate owned the club. More than 40 illegal casinos were operating in the area, none compared to the Beverly Hills. Top-notch entertainment, which we'll talk about here shortly, and gourmet dining. And maybe more importantly than anything else, they had fair games, not fixed. Most places down in Newport, you couldn't possibly win. If you were lucky enough to actually win some money, you walked outside and you would get roughed up and robbed, and the owners would actually take your money back. And you could not go to the police. Why could you not go to the police? Because they were paid off by the mob. This is the original Trianon room in the supper club. Held 500, and very, very high posh atmosphere there. The main bar seated 50 around the bar and another 50 in the room. The staff of the Beverly Hills, there's only over 200 people here. Again, the staff down in the other clubs might be 4 or 5 people, and the showgirls were not very pretty, and the waiting staff was not very effective, but all top-notch people here. Some of the entertainers, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis, Marilyn Monroe, these are some of the people that would have graced the stage at the Trianon room back in the heyday of the Beverly Hills Country Club. The 40s to the 60s, the mob expands. They force Jimmy Breek out of the Lookout House. The Mafia takes ownership of the Yorkshire, Tropicana, Flamingo, Guys and Dolls. I mean, most of you recognize these names. All of these were run by the Cleveland Syndicate. Every now and again, a group of, we'll call them do-gooders, moved into the area deciding that crime and prostitution and gambling was not good for the region. They wanted it gone. And it never worked because the mob would always hear about they would hear ahead of time if any police raids were going to take place, and they would simply hide all the gambling paraphernalia. And most of the local police didn't care anyway. But a group later named the Committee of 500 was organized, mostly by Fort Thomas residents, not Newport. But they came in and they put George Ratterman on the ticket for sheriff. He was well known in the area, a former football player for Cleveland Browns, very well known. He told everyone that he could not be bribed by the mob. Well, Charles Lester and Tito Carenzi spearheaded a plan to disgrace him. They actually drugged him, put him in bed with one of the known showgirls. The police just happened to be there to take pictures. I don't know how they were tipped off. But he's, national news now. We've got this do-good sheriff in bed with one of the showgirls. But blood tests clearly show that he had been drugged. It hit the fan, as people say. Many were arrested, police officers, police chiefs. While a lot of those people were acquitted, gambling, the illegal gambling as we know it, was gone from Newport. Most people thought the mob left as well. Unfortunately, that was not the case. But Newport became a ghost town. Traditional businesses closed. Vacant shops and storefronts were everywhere. Most of the store owners that I talked to told me that they did not want the Committee of 500 moving in. They wanted the crime and corruption because business was good when they were there. Some places were open 24 hours a day just to handle all the traffic coming from the Beverly Hills and the other places. Well, the Cleveland mob, most of them moved to Las Vegas and the Caribbean, but off-track betting still was a billion-dollar business in Newport. You could go into any of these clubs and again get buzzed into that back room and place bets on horse races all over the country. A new list of major players, and we won't run down that list, but some of the more popular names: Sammy Eisner, Screw Andrews, Buck Llewellyn. These are all people that in the 60s and 70s were kind of running the show in Newport. And a new mafia enters the town. Most people remember Newport in the 70s as the porn shops, the adult theaters. Those were not private-run companies and businesses. Those were all paying a share of their money to the New York syndicate. And Cleveland's stronghold still was the gambling with the horse racing and things of that nature. If there was a glimmer of hope, it was Richard Schilling that came in 1969 and purchased the old country club, did $2 million in renovations. Mob threats began immediately, and on June 21st, 1970, the place burned down. Most people don't remember that. It was determined arson, but I say police still being paid off, question mark, because the local police filed their report and said that there were 7 fires burning at the same time when they first arrived, that 2 doors had been broken down, the electric and gas had been shut off during renovations, but the state police came in and said that they could not determine any cause. That's with pictures like this one of gasoline cans found in the rubble that did not belong to any of the workers. But the Kentucky State Police couldn't figure that out. Well, Richard Schilling was given a choice. He could get out of the entertainment business, which was the mob's suggestion. But he decided not to do that. He expanded the place, changed the name to the Beverly Hills Supper Club, and actually built on some new rooms, including the Cabaret Room, which had a capacity of 1,000 patrons, which was the largest of its kind in the entire Midwest. But the threats continued. Here's a picture of the revamped outside. The garden area, which was host to many weddings over the years. This was the Crystal Rooms on the 2nd floor. Another shot of the garden area, garden rooms. Part of the garden rooms had glass walls and glass ceilings so you could eat it under the starlight. This was the main dining room. And the old Trianon room, they turned into what was called the Empire Room, but it was no longer the main showroom. This was used for high school proms and weddings. You could have a live band there and things, but the Cabaret Room became the new showroom. Got a lot of the 1970s decor, wood paneling everywhere. And then this was the Cabaret Room, much larger stage, and again seated 1,000. Well, I call the decade of the 70s the decade of violence. The Galaxy Club, the Lookout House, these are all places that burned down in arson or suspicious fires. Gangster killings were pretty commonplace. And the police corruption continues, I say, because very few of these were ever investigated thoroughly. More of the list. Former Governor Breathitt came forward saying that the Cleveland mob threatened him with bodily harm. He was going to outlaw pinball machines as a form of entertainment, a form of gambling, and they told him not to do that. And I guess he listened, because it was never done. Greater Cincinnati Airport Terminal had an arson fire as well. Unfortunately, 2 airport firefighters were killed in that fire. Changes in Cleveland. The Cleveland Syndicate became far more violent than they used to be in recent years. And I say, why is all of this important? Well, I want to make sure we're talking about northern Kentucky. This is not the 20s through the 40s. It's not New York or Chicago. There were 45 car bombings, 60 murders, and 40 arson or suspicious fires in nightclubs in the greater Cincinnati area in the 1960s and 70s. Back at the Beverly Hills, business was better than ever. A 500-room hotel and convention center was planned. As a matter of fact, there were bulldozers on the property the night of the fire. They were clearing land for that expansion. More rumors from employees that I interviewed that the mob went into the place bad. And a couple of employees said that they heard people come in and say, if you don't sell us this place, you may not have a place to sell. It became clear to a lot of people that the Beverly Hills was going to be torched, but no one knew when. Well, May 28, 1977, beautiful summer afternoon, nice weather, warm. The Roadrunners Club had come up from the Ashland, Kentucky area with 2 Greyhound buses full, mostly senior citizens on what was their big event of the year. Bar mitzvah going on. There was a small, intimate dinner party for some doctors and their wives. 4 separate weddings going on at the Beverly Hills that night. The Dayton Auto Club, retirement parties, other anniversaries, birthdays, and of course a lot of people were just there for a private dinner. But about 2,500 patrons and employees were expected to be in the club that night. Early afternoon, David Brock, one of the 16-year-old busboys, enters the zebra room. He sees maintenance workers on ladders. Several employees later reported witnessing these people. A reservationist saw unknown workers in the basement earlier in the week as well as that morning, and one waitress sees an unknown group cleaning the walls that led from the front of the club down to the cabaret room. There's nothing in the Kentucky State Police files that show that they investigated any of these what would be considered suspicious activities. From 5:30 to 8:30 p.m., several guests in the zebra room hear muffled blasts coming from within the walls or from the basement. They complain to staff that the room is too hot. Patrons in the main bar and crystal rooms later tell investigators they smell smoke in the club at this time. And I should underline this or capitalize this. People coming up the driveway later reported they had seen smoke coming from the roof of the building when they arrived. Many witnesses as early as 5:45 p.m. There were over a dozen people that later told investigators they saw smoke coming from the building. No one reported this to club staff. In the cabaret room, backstage, John Davidson, who was the mainliner for the evening, was actually shaving. On the stage was the comedy duo of Teeter and McDonald. They had just taken the stage. At 8:58, the Vandover sisters, 2 waitresses, walk into the zebra room. They're looking for tray stands. The zebra room held a small wedding reception earlier, but by 8:30, these people were all gone. And they walk in and they immediately see smoke whispering around the ceiling. Eileen Druckman, the reservationist, also smells smoke at this time. Margie Schilling is informed, and she telephones authorities. Now, this was way before 911. She actually calls the Fort Thomas Police Department, who in turn have to call and radio the other authorities. But very quickly, Newport, Fort Thomas, and Southgate fire departments are responding, and staff begins a massive evacuation of the club. The main bar, the dining room, the Empire rooms are first to vacate. It only takes a few minutes, and there's about 600 people that are safe. All of these people were able to exit through the front doors with very few exceptions. Employees and owners try to extinguish the fire. A lot of witnesses, well before any flames were noticed, said that they saw employees running through the club with fire extinguishers. I should point out there was no fire visible in the zebra room at this time. The Viennese rooms are notified. The people there, about 135, quickly flee. But in the cabaret room, no one has any idea that there's an emergency taking place. It's well on the far side of the building. Here's a quick layout, and I don't know how close I can get to this thing. This is the front entrance here, through the foyer and into the main bar. Then you could come down past the spiral staircase that would have taken you upstairs. And then this is the long hallway that would take you down to the cabaret room. The Viennese room is here, the bar mitzvah and the dinner party for the doctors and their wives. The Empire room is full of 500 people with a savings and loan group, and again other groups elsewhere, but the cabaret room was the main showroom. So one of the first photographs that shows smoke coming from the building. You can't see from the back of the room, but the girl in front has a smile on her face. No one thinks that this is going to be much of a tragedy. They just want the small fire that's maybe in the kitchen to be put out so that they can go about their evening. On the second floor, there's about 200 people partying. Most of the employees lead those people down the spiral staircase and out the front door. Wayne Dammert, who's the banquet captain upstairs, and several other employees end up leading about 100 people through a back hallway once smoke comes up that main staircase. There are 2 people that were part of a fashion show that are in a dressing room. By the time they figure out what's going on, it's too late to find their way out. They will not survive. This is one of the first color photographs. The bright light is not flames. That's just lights from the canopy there. But you can see this is what firefighters saw when they first arrived. Smoke billowing out of the parts of the roof, and they knew immediately that they had a serious situation on their hands. Fort Thomas and Southgate firefighters arrive around 9:04. They immediately call for additional departments. Firemen begin assessing the situation. They start running hose lines. Most at this time are assisting with the evacuation. I talked to a couple of firefighters that told me as they pulled up the driveway, there were so many people standing at the top of the driveway, they said, "Oh, thank God, everyone got out okay." It still does not look like there's any casualties. There's a lot of people that are overcome, that there's plenty of club staff and other patrons to help them. Again, that was before firefighters arrived. Walter Bailey is considered one of the dozens of heroes. He's, again, another 16-year-old busboy. He finds out through the grapevine that there's a fire in the zebra room. Well, he's in the cabaret room. He actually delays only about 45 seconds what he's going to do. He's 16 years old. He knows that there's 1,000 people in the cabaret room. They just ordered their drinks. They paid for fancy dinners. Should he go in and evacuate that room, he's not seen any smoke. He's not seen any flames. But about 9:05, he steps onto the stage, takes the microphone from the comedy duo, and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention? There's a small fire on the opposite side of the building. We ask that you please leave. You can go through the doors that you came through. There's also an emergency exit here. There's also an emergency exit there." And he leaves the stage. Unfortunately, most of the people were not paying any attention. Some of the people that did pay attention thought he was actually part of the comedy routine because the handoff of the microphone went so smoothly, so they did not leave. Others had just sat down. They were talking with their family and friends that they hadn't seen for a while. They were not paying any attention. Only about 1/3 of the room immediately gathered their belongings and started leaving. Of course, all of those people made it out safely with no problems at all. One of the shots from the back of the club is people are leaving through one of the emergency exits, and this is another emergency exit. This was on the east side, closer to Highway 27. About 9:18, firefighters learn that there are people still in the cabaret room. There's still no fire there. All but about 500 people have escaped that room. Flames and smoke finally race down that long hallway. They finally break out of the zebra room and cut off the main egress from the cabaret room. Now people are forced through those 2 emergency exits. It's estimated that there were about 100 firefighters on the scene by 9:30. This is a shot from the bottom of the hill, the main driveway. Flames coming out the roof. This is later in the evening, of course. And this is much later. The problem in the cabaret room was two things. Number one, it was designed for 1,000 people, but it was very close quarters. But the two emergency exits, again, the main hallway, the main exit was blocked off pretty quickly in the event. The side hallway here was filled with smoke pretty early, and the only way out were two emergency exits at the far ends. Fortunately, on this side, the banquet captain was notified early enough that he could change these doors. On both sides, they were called waiter doors. You've seen these where you can push on the right-hand door and it opens up. The left-hand door is made to open in. So you can push on it all day long, it's not going to open. But on this side, he was able to move both doors so that they moved outward. Everyone was able to move out of the cabaret room and into the hallway here. But once in the darkened hallway, they quickly became lost. Some people went into the dressing room area, in the backstage area. Many people turned left into what was a closet, and there were 12 bodies found in the closet. And then many people were no more than 10 feet away from the exit and were overcome by smoke and perished there. On the other side, unfortunately, it was much, much worse. The waiter doors were not reset, so you have 100 people or more trying to get out one small doorway. And of course, people started shoving and pushing. People pushed up against that door that would not open. And they were overcome with smoke. They fell to the ground. People fell on top of them, on top of them, on top of them. If they were able to make it out into the other hallway, that was not the exit. There was still a room to go through there. Many people got lost and disoriented. Some people were found behind the bar. Some, again, turned into the wrong direction. And, of course, quite a few did make it out. Folks, I'll be honest with you, I had a very difficult decision deciding which pictures to put in my book. But unfortunately, we live in a time now where I tell you 169 people were killed, and that doesn't seem to mean much. But seeing the beautiful garden area littered with bodies is something that I think that the younger generation needs to see. This is an event that we should never, ever forget. The beautiful chapel that became a triage center that night, where a lot of those nurses were put to work. This is a shot from the next morning, obviously, from helicopter. And for those that are not familiar with the place, just to give you an idea of the scope of the size of this place, this here is the cabaret room, which seated 1,000. You've got many other showrooms as well as a second floor on part of the building. The Fort Thomas Armory was turned into a makeshift morgue. Over the next few days, families came viewing going body to body looking for loved ones. In the initial news releases, it was reported that there was a 20-minute delay before anyone alerted the authorities. Many fire exits were chained and locked. How many people remember locked fire exits? A few of you. They said nearly 3 times the capacity was in the cabaret room. There was no sprinkler system. Looking back on it, I think this was terrible reporting by newsmen that just wanted to be first. In the grand jury's investigation, all of these things were proven to be false. Now, there was no sprinkler system, but none was required by law at that time. The 20-minute delay, we clearly know that the authorities were called immediately. There were 2 exits that were locked. One was upstairs that was simply a plywood door that led out onto the roof of the canopy. And luckily, no one broke through that door to get out because the firefighters were not able to. They didn't have any ladders set up or anything to get people off of the roof at that time. So luckily they waited and went through the stairway down and through the kitchen. And the other one was in the Viennese room, which through remodeling was not visible on the inside, was only visible on the outside, number one. Number two, the people in the cabaret room would have to have gone through the fire to get to that exit. But it was reported that there was a fire exit chained and locked. Well, there was, I guess. Governor Carroll quickly took charge of the investigation. I know he's a governor, not an investigator, but he took charge. The Kentucky State Police quickly reported that the fire started in or near the zebra room. They found major electrical problems to the building. They actually said that the Schillings were negligent and should be indicted for murder. They began bulldozing on Monday. I'll repeat that. The fire was Saturday night, and the Governor Carroll ordered bulldozing on Monday afternoon. They found several code violations, including the locked doors, the overcrowding, the 20-minute delay. They also said there was no fire in the basement. I'll underline that. We'll come back to that. Kentucky State Police had no fire in the basement. There was a grand jury that was put in place to look at the Schillings to see if there was enough evidence to indict them for anything. And I think a lot of the people in this region were dumbfounded when their report came out saying that there was no overcrowding. There were no deaths due to code violation. There was no delay in reporting the fire, and they found no negligence at the hands of the owners. They actually gave great praise to the staff for being able to evacuate more than 2,300 patrons and employees. They also said the fire started somewhere near the zebra room, was most likely electrical in nature, but because part of the building had been bulldozed, they could come up with no better definition than that. Officially, yeah, still today, the fire was somewhere near the zebra room, was most likely electrical, and numerous code violations led to a high death toll. The Kentucky State Police have no mention of the witnesses that the workers saw earlier in the day. They have no evidence of fire in the basement, and they see no sign of arson. Stan Chesley was one of the few attorneys that would step forward and look at a civil trial possibility. He knew well in advance that he could not prove exactly how the fire started or why so many people died. So he decided to sue everyone. This became the first class action lawsuit of its kind. He ended up going into 3 phases because there were 1,151 people named as defendants. Phase 1, he took on the aluminum wiring companies. He actually lost that case. He took on the PVC companies. He was going to prove that there was so much plastic in the carpeting, draperies, plastic burning is what emitted the toxic smoke. That's what killed people. He didn't win that case either. He went after the products companies. If you simply provided cloth napkins to the Beverly Hills Supper Club, you were indicted. He was going to prove that the smoke, the burning napkins, that's what killed everyone. Well, he lost that case as well. Now, it's very important to know that most of these companies that were involved have insurance policies. Most started paying out-of-court settlements. They did not want to go to court. If they had $1 million policy, they offered Stan $500,000. He countered, they countered. And he was collecting millions of dollars while this was all going on. He was able to launch a retrial of the aluminum wiring companies because of some jury misconduct, which is in the book, but it's just too much to go into right now. But incredibly, the question put to the jury was changed in the retrial. In the original trial, they asked specifically, could aluminum wiring, was aluminum wiring the cause of the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire? And they quickly said no. There was not enough proof to show that. Secondly, in the retrial, they were asked, could a binding screw connecting aluminum wiring with copper wiring play a significant role in a fire? Well, they had to say yes, it could have been a binding screw, it could have been a toppled candle, it could have been a lit cigarette, it could have been arson. But he actually won the case. At that time, only General Electric was the only company left. Everyone else had settled out of court, and he did win that trial. Most people today remember Stan Chesley as winning millions of dollars for the victims and their families, when in reality he didn't really win much of the case at all. But he did collect millions. It's estimated that it was about 53 million was collected, and about half of that went to the victims and their families. The rest went to him and his attorney staff. David Brock, we mentioned before, the 16-year-old busboy. Several months after the fire, he went to the owners and said, has anyone ever questioned those maintenance workers that were in the zebra room? And Mr. Schilling said, what are you talking about? You mean like 6 months before the fire? And he said, no, they were there the day of the fire. Well, what were they doing, Dave? Dave said, well, they told me they were working on the air conditioning units. And Mr. Schilling said, well, there are no air conditioning units in the ceiling of the zebra room. So we actually, all of the Schilling's paperwork was kept at his home. We went through that. There's no record of any maintenance workers being hired to do any work the week the Beverly Hills burned down. Dave kept quiet for 25 years, but at the 30-year anniversary, he realized that there were other witnesses that saw the same people he saw. He thought he was the only one that saw them. He went to the Kentucky State Police with what he knew, and they gave him no help at all. And again, that's a long story that's in the book that we don't have time to get into. It's in the newspapers that the Kentucky State Police looked at this as possible, as a possibility of reopening the investigation, but I can tell you they did not. So he formed his own team. He contacted me, of course, a local history author and researcher. A close friend of him, Tom McConaughey, went through thousands and thousands of papers. We also, thank goodness, got a hold of Glenn Corbett, who was a world-renowned fire science expert, still professor at John Jay College of Fire Science in New York. Rodney Raby was Kentucky State Fire Marshal twice, looked through all the investigation materials that we had. Pete Sabino was a retired captain with Cincinnati Fire Department. Rodney Raby and Glenn Corbett especially very quickly determined that something was terribly wrong in the initial investigation, and clearly the fire was not started by aluminum wiring. In the reinvestigation, we went through all the files from the Kentucky State Police, the National Fire Protection Association, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the FBI, had 600 pages. It was in an arson file, by the way, that we looked through, but there's no arson. Over 5 years of in-depth research and numerous interviews, incredibly, the most damaging evidence came from the original Kentucky State Police files. Are you sitting down? The Kentucky State Fire Marshal's Division was not allowed in the basement after Monday. By order of Governor Carroll, they were no longer permitted there. As a matter of fact, he told them to go back to Frankfort. What they determined before they were kicked out was that the basement was the major concentration point for the fire. There was evidence of tampering throughout the basement. They found timers in the rubble. Some were set on AM, some were set on PM. They determined very quickly that the fire started in an air conditioning unit below the zebra room in conjunction with a breaker box located there, and that the fire moved into the walls and up into the ceiling of the second floor before burning through the walls and becoming where it could be discovered. There were explosions and tampering of equipment in the basement. There were heavy V patterns in the basement, even though the Kentucky State Police say there's no signs of major fire there. The evidence shows that the fire burned down into the zebra room and hallway, and clear evidence that the fire started in the basement. Now, these photographs are nowhere to be found. I will back up a second. Ronnie Friels, we determined, was the Kentucky State Police trooper that took most of the pictures. And I won't say how we did this, but we may have misrepresented ourselves to Mr. Friels and found out that he had a nice private collection of photographs in his home that he was glad to give us a slideshow presentation of. Luckily, we took our camera and took some pictures of his pictures, because once he found out who we were, that went away. And we still have a lawsuit against the state police for access to these photographs. But here is a picture that he showed us of the air conditioning unit that exploded below the zebra room. The motor was found about 20 feet away. Some of the V patterns in the basement below the zebra room. This was what we call a void space that led from that area in the basement all the way to the ceiling of the second floor and worked really like a chimney. And this was the major concentration of the worst part of the fire. On the left, you'll see some of the tampering. These are wires that don't have a plug on them. They were stripped and stuck in there, and they were run over to that air conditioning unit where the timers were found. Evidence of the downward fire. By the way, this is one of the electrical outlets that Stan Chesley says was filled with aluminum wiring and caused the fire. You can see there's no damage to it at all. But the fire clearly burned from the ceiling down. This is the wall of the zebra room. And this is a wall of that main hallway that led down to the cabaret room. No damage to the bottom of the wall. All the damage came from the ceiling down. The summary of the new investigation, there's no physical evidence whatsoever to indicate faulty aluminum wiring. As a matter of fact, aluminum wiring wasn't mentioned in the investigation until the civil suits came along. There were some minor code violations. No deaths occurred as a result of those violations. Nearly a dozen witnesses had told authorities immediately after the fire about suspicious activities they had seen. None of those made the official report. Most initial investigators, including the Kentucky State Fire Marshals, pointed to the basement. Some of those investigators were kept from going downstairs. There's clear cover-up and conspiracy, in our opinion, involving Governor Carroll and the Kentucky State Police, and the fire clearly spread from the basement, within the walls, and into the ceilings, and then down from above. All of the physical evidence that we can locate points to arson. The state of Kentucky still has no permanent memorial on one of the nation's worst tragedies. Again, 169 people were killed. This is a monument that some volunteers have put together on the site that you can see if you're driving south on 471 at the Route 27 interchange. And folks, I will mention that there is a History Day special today. The original edition hardcover book, which sold for $45, is available at the Kenton County Historical Society's booth, as well as a table over here, and they are $30 today. And folks, I'm open for a few questions. We have some time. And I've been told you're not allowed to leave unless there's at least 5 questions. So, yes, ma'am.
Do you ever feel in danger yourself for telling this information so publicly?
Do you have a gun? No, that's a very common question, and I'll tell you, there were things that I found out early in the investigation that caused my wife and I both to get our concealed carry permits. There was a stretch of about a year that was not pleasant. You could write movies about, I suppose. I remember leaving the house one day and telling my wife, now this is exactly where I'm supposed to be going. The gentleman wanted to meet me under the railroad bridge that led from Covington to Ludlow. And she said, are you going? I said, yes, I'm going. I have to see what he has. He really didn't tell me anything I didn't know. I had a 2-hour interview with a gentleman one time, and I came up from my office, and my wife said, who were you on the phone with so long? And I said, Henry Hill. Why does that name sound familiar? I said, well, did you see the movie Goodfellas? He's the guy that was put in the witness protection program from the New York Mafia. Oh, yeah. Well, I found out that, and this is another little history bit, but he was not very good at keeping his mouth closed. Obviously, he was one of the biggest snitches ever discovered in the mob. But his third location of being relocated was to Independence, Kentucky in 1978. So I thought maybe he had something that he could tell me, and unfortunately he didn't. But he had plenty to tell me, because he would not shut up. So, but at any rate, yeah, today, no. I think that most of the people that I name in the book as being part of this conspiracy, and especially the people that we think actually set the fire, are all deceased. That's one of the reasons I don't think the case will ever be reopened. Besides the fact that the Kentucky State Police would have to admit wrongdoing. Yes, ma'am.
Has anybody really followed up with investigating the governor and his ties with this?
Well, I didn't get to interviewing myself, but David Brock and Tom McConaughey did. We actually wanted to know specifically why he ordered the place bulldozed. So we asked him in the hallway of the Capitol building. And he said, I don't remember giving that order. And I said, well, we have a signed affidavit by the bulldoze operator that said that you told him to bulldoze the property and get it leveled as quickly as you can. And he said, well, I don't remember when I gave that order. And I said, well, here's a picture of you standing on the running board of the bulldozer. And he said, well, I don't remember when that was taken. I said, well, it was published in the Monday Afternoon Kentucky. He told us to get he asked us to leave. And we've asked for further interviews, but incredibly that hasn't happened. Yes, ma'am.
I heard a story that the photographer who took the sneaky pictures of Radiman, his grandmother was on the 500 committee,
And he felt guilty, so he gave the information.
Yeah, it's incredible the amount of corruption that was going on back then. But I mentioned, briefly that it's incredible how the Kentucky State Police just or the Newport Police just happened to be there with cameras for, in the hallway of the hotel.
Yeah.
There's a book called The Bluegrass Conspiracy.
Yes.
There's a whole lot of things about you and Carol.
Absolutely, and I cover some of this in the book. Obviously, in 45 minutes we can't cover everything, but there is a book called The Bluegrass Conspiracy, which clearly shows that there are 7 Kentucky governors in a row that have been investigated for many, many things you would not believe. It's hard to pin something down with enough evidence to indict anyone, and people have asked me, do you really think Governor Carroll was a part of the mob, or was he getting paid off? And I don't have that evidence, so all I can show you is the evidence that I have, and you can make your own decision from that. But for him to actually give orders to bulldoze the property, he told someone else that he was so mad at the Shillings that he wanted to make sure they could never rebuild there, so let's bulldoze the property. Well, if I own the property and I want to rebuild, what's the first thing I'm going to do? I'm going to bulldoze the property, get it all level so I can build the place. So I don't know. He's either involved in some way, or he's an absolute idiot for bulldozing the crime scene less than 48 hours after the fire. Yes, sir.
I got a story. I was up there. I lived right down the street from there on Grandview. And matter of fact, the fire chief before Thomas lived next door to me. And we were out cutting the grass, and all of a sudden he wasn't there. And I asked his wife what happened to him, and she said, Beverly Hills is on fire. So they were, a few hours later, before we had bottled water back in the day, they were asking for water, and he had these drums.
Yeah.
Well, I stayed there the whole time until we went up to the armory and different one. But that night, I guess it was Sunday morning, they had all the bodies laying on the hillside there for the army trucks to come up. They couldn't get up the driveway. They had to come up the hill, so they had those 6x6 army trucks come up and take the bodies up to the armory. And they were all laying on the hillside. It's a true story. We sitting there, right, and here comes the snake right across the top of the bodies. I'll never forget that moment.
Wow.
What, right? I guess it was a black snake, but it went right across the top of those bodies.
That's incredible. That's incredible. It's amazing as I go out speaking that how many people have a personal connection. I mean, this is something. Again, if there's some people here that's not from the area originally, I mean, this is like the Kennedy assassination. You remembered exactly what you were doing and where you were when you first heard about this. I mentioned my personal story in the book that I lived next door to the ambulance driver for Covington, and of course their scanners were going off, and I was 16, 17. They were knocking on my door. Beverly Hills is on fire. I'm like, well, I'm not going to drive all the way over there. It'll be out by the time we get over there. No, they're calling for Covington to help. I'm like, okay, that's pretty unusual. We ended up walking up Mock Road because they had it blocked off, and I tell people in the story, we walked up that front hillside about halfway up, and there were 5 bodies that obviously had been laid there. And again, I had people tell me, no, there were no bodies on the front of the building. Well, yeah, they were moved around back later on, but nothing like the movies. No, smoke under their nose, no burnt clothes. They looked like they had just been laid there sleeping. One gentleman had a shoe missing. One lady had a shoe missing. Other than that, no sign of any tragedy whatsoever. And it took me a long time. I say a long time. It probably took a minute and a half, 2 minutes for me to realize. Because I remember saying, why are they laying here? Why don't they get up and move? They're so close to it. It just doesn't sink in. I thank God to this day that we did not walk around to the back of the building. I don't think I would ever be brave. Yes, ma'am.
What about David Brock, the true hero, 16 years old? Has he looked back? Of course, you met him. Did he look back? And
David Brock that discovered the
busboy.
The busboy that saw the workers in the building. He started
alerted the cabaret.
Oh, Walter Bailey. Walter Bailey. Yeah, 16 years old. He it's still a dream to him. He tells me, I've interviewed him several times. His quote has sort of been misrepresented, he thinks, but I talked to so many people that said, well, this is what he said when he was on the stage. So we put that together, that he was very concise, very clear on what to do. He doesn't see himself as a hero, but you know, certainly if he would have hesitated another minute, or if he'd have decided, oh, I'm not going to get fired by evacuating this building when I haven't even seen a fire, that certainly was an option for him. So he's certainly one of the many heroes. There were many unsung heroes. I have you know, many reports from people in the dining room that said that, and also the garden rooms, that said that these waiters and waitresses did not leave. They did not leave their station until all of their people were, that's what they call them. I was not going anywhere until my people were outside. So there's a lot of, certainly a lot of heroes. Yes, sir.
Are there any previous fires?
At the Beverly Hills, some small fires, obviously the one we mentioned before the place actually opened. There were some small fires, and, also car fires in the parking lot. I mean, it was not uncommon for fire crews to go up there, but as I mentioned, Fort Thomas, especially Fort Thomas, I guess that's higher on the avenue. There's a place where you can actually see part of the club, and they can see smoke, you know, giving them enough advance notice that this is not a typical small fire run. Yes, ma'am.
Do you remember John Davidson got out, the singer, he got out, but his musician went back in to get his music?
Well, there were several musicians that died in the fire. Most of those were local musicians that were in the band. John Davidson was witnessed by many people actually holding that east emergency exit door open for quite a few minutes. But his musical arranger from California did perish in the fire. Yes, sir.
Has Davidson ever commented?
Davidson was never. He did one interview that I'm aware of, and it was many years after the fire. His career was nothing the same after that. He was the gentleman that had to go to the Fort Thomas Armory to identify his composer, arranger. So he was really never the same. If you talk to people that know him, just his demeanor overall was never the same after the fire. Someone else? Yeah, David.
You have all this new evidence you just showed us up here. Was this evidence presented to any law enforcement? If so, was it presented to?
Well,
and did they do anything?
We took it to the Post 6 Kentucky State Police at one time, and according to, this was the first time that we brought it up, and according to the trooper that was working the desk at that day, she said that two troopers from Frankfurt came up, wanted to see the box of evidence. They opened one of the lids, they took out one folder, they looked at it for less than 30 seconds. They said, let's go to lunch. And when they came back, they said, you put it all away. That was the first look into the possibility of reinvestigation, was about 30 seconds. We actually did take it to Governor Brashear. He formed a committee. I'm excited. Let's put a committee together and we'll look at the possibility of reopening the investigation. As soon as I found, and who should be on the committee? I know who should be on the committee. Fire investigators, FBI, arson investigators, fire marshals. The committee was made up of 4 attorneys. 2 of those worked on the original investigation. And clearly all they wanted to do was, can the state of Kentucky get in trouble if we reinvestigate this? So I was not surprised at all when 30 days later they said, and this is what's in the newspaper, there's no evidence worth investigating the Supper Club fire again. Well, they didn't even look at it. Yes, sir.
What was the motive for this?
The motive was money, as always. The club was obviously extremely successful at that time. I mean, it was the peak of its career, really. And the property was prime. Interstate 471 was just being built. I should ask you, what government official was in charge of deciding the route of Interstate 471? Governor Carroll. I know that's just a coincidence. And whose property did it decide to go through? Was it Sam Schrader, who was at one time in charge of the Cleveland Syndicate? I know that's just a coincidence. But So that's why Interstate 471 does what it does. But it was certainly going to be, right there at the exit with Route 27, and obviously more of a prime property than it is today.
I know you mentioned the timers
Yeah.
being set at PM and AM.
Yeah.
So the theory was they were supposed to be AM.
Yeah. The team of investigators are really split 50-50. Some of them think that this was a deliberate act to cause the fire at that time. I'm not one of those. I think that the clear issue was that the fire was supposed to start at 6 o'clock, 6:30 Sunday morning. If you look back at the history of these nightclub fires, they almost always were on a Sunday morning. But I think the intention was not to kill anyone, to burn the place down on Sunday morning, not Saturday night. The two people that I name that actually we feel actually set the fire, those people blew themselves up setting a fire in Covington about 8 months later. So they were not very good at what they did. They set a fire in a warehouse on Pike Street in Covington, and when they opened the door to leave, kaboom, they were found down the block. So, yeah, I'm one of the many that think that the fire, the death toll was not intentional. Yes, sir.
Didn't Schillings own the Lookout House when it burnt before the...
That's a common misconception. They owned the Lookout House and brought great success to that place, but they sold that in 1971 and it burned in 74.
Oh.
Yeah. And firefighters, by the way, told me that the first responders to the Lookout House said they knew it was arson in 30 seconds because when they went in, fire was coming up the stairway from the basement. Fires don't usually, I guess, travel up very easy, but they said that was arson. Yeah, let's go here.
It seems like you really do have some very concrete evidence, and while presented, you've obviously done a great deal of research. Isn't there any way to go under federal auspices? Is the state won't in any way look at this kind of corruption?
Well, there probably is. What I feel is concrete evidence to some is not. I mean, there's speculation to some of this. I mean, we even thought about going to the site and actually digging up some materials. We now know that the hallway, for instance, I mentioned briefly, that was being washed down, we know was actually being applied. There was an accelerant being applied to that. We know the family of the people that did that. They're named in the book. But with 25 years of wear and tear and erosion up there, that's not a possibility. So it would be a hard fight, and I guess the big question is who's going to pay for it? Because, I haven't made a dime with the book. That's all gone to the Historical Society. So it's hard, and that's, again, why one reason the state says they're not going to investigate, because they said it would cost them millions to put together a team of researchers to really investigate it. Number one, they don't have that. Number two, the people that we name as being a part of this are all deceased now. There's no one to indict. But I've talked to so many families of the victims, and with one exception out of more than 100, they've told me they want the truth. They don't care if anyone's indicted. If it was arson, just tell us that it was arson, and we'd be happy. I think there was one in the back. No? Yes, sir. Ma'am. Sorry.
What was the history of the Schillings owning the Lookout House? When did they own that?
I don't recall exactly when they opened. They only had the place. They own a. I don't know how many people remember down on Dixie Highway in what's now Fort Wright. There was the President's Motor Inn. There was a restaurant, I can't recall the name of it now, but they owned those places. And it was the Hofbräu House, but it was something before that they owned, and they brought success to that. But somewhere 69, 70, yeah, they bought the Lookout House. They only had that place for about 3 or 4 years.
It was empty in the 50s.
Yeah, it was empty during the time of the fire. They were going through remodeling, and which happens a lot when you're remodeling places when it burns down. They got the insurance. Am I being told?
Yeah, about 30 something.
Okay, so we do have to end up. Folks, I greatly appreciate it. It's been a great audience.